What did you make of the one where he talked about Eddie Jones ringing him to let him know he wasn't going to the World Cup, saying, "You're fucked, mate"?
Well, I mean, I've been lucky enough to go and watch England train, and we've talked about this a few times, haven't we? And I was gobsmacked at how intense the training was, how long it was, etc., etc. And you know, what you will get from Eddie Jones is, on occasions like that, just honesty. He's just been honest with him, mate. You're fucked. You're absolutely fucked, mate. You're not going to the World Cup. And it was all about his knee. But I've seen the training, and it's brutal, and we've seen the environment, and obviously, and it's like every international team that's ever been before. While that head coach is in charge, as a player, you may moan between yourselves. You may go for the odd Sappuccino. I can imagine being in Scotland when Jim was playing. It was like Sappuccino for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But as players, you know, I suppose the issue is you sometimes with such a strong character like Eddie Jones, and we've talked about it on here before, you can't feel you've got the confidence to go up to him and say, "Hey, mate, you know, we need to dial back training a little bit," because actually one of your leaders is Owen Farrell, who probably trains harder than anyone in the world and doesn't have a social life. Or all he cares about is, "I want to play rugby and I want to win. We're playing touch, we're playing tiddlywinks, whatever it is. I'm going to fucking win." Teabag. So it doesn't surprise me anything that's come out. You know, having seen it and witnessed it, but ultimately Eddie Jones doesn't care what the players think after they're finished. It's all for him about the winning and taking them to a level that he feels is good enough to win the World Cup, which ultimately we didn't do. But he's always said, "I try and make training sessions way harder than games, because then games are easier." And then one of the other quotes is from Dylan Hartley. He says when he got to the weekend, he was absolutely bollocks for a game, and all he wanted to do was win the game, so he had an easier week next week under Eddie Jones. And you know, when you've kind of got a authoritarian coach in Eddie Jones.
Dictatorship.
There you go. Well, let's not get too political, but yeah, I hear you, Jim. You know, and Owen Farrell's the captain. Who's going to go against those two? Because, you know, ultimately, when a player then retires or a player leaves and doesn't get picked again, or the coach leaves, then things come out the woodwork. And we've always said that things will come out once those changes happen. And, you know, look at Danny Care. I know for a fact Danny Care had a fairly brutal conversation with Eddie Jones when he was playing for England against Japan, which was his last game back in sort of November 2018, I think it was. And at the time, it was always Ben Youngs and Danny Care. Ben Youngs was the first choice. Danny Care's coming off the bench. And they played against Japan, didn't play very well. Eddie Jones dropped Danny Care for the next game. And off the back of that, Danny Care went to Eddie Jones and said to him, "Hey, Eddie, what's the crack? You know, I want to be able to play in the front line. I want to play with Owen Farrell at 10. I want to play with Billy Vunipola at 8. But my opportunity was with some of the second choice players." He hasn't been seen again. He hasn't played Test match rugby ever again because he questioned Eddie Jones. And you know, that's Eddie Jones is right as the head coach. You live and die by the sword, don't you? And you know, the other one was treating players like a piece of meat. And that's effectively what people are.
Well, he also mentioned, Dylan did, and he quoted in saying about the generation of players being crash dummies for sport in transition from semi-professionalism, right? So what he's talking about is that our age, our what's the word?
Demographic?
No, not our demographic.
Generation?
So what he's saying is our generation, our era, Goodey, and we're probably the back end of that. Dylan's obviously just come out of that now. I think we are. I think that's exactly what it is. And listening to Eddie Jones last week on a rival podcast, I've actually warmed a little bit to him in terms of how open he's become. But you can tell there's an air of it, and I said it, around the dictatorship that he kind of runs. But ultimately, what he said to Dylan, and as harsh as it is, was he right? He says to him, "You fucked." Was he right or was he wrong?
He was right, yeah. He speaks the truth.
Exactly. And you can't handle the truth, as they said in A Few Good Fellas, or whatever it's called. And unfortunately, and this is the thing that people need to get away from in terms of rugby, right? How it used to be. And there is still this rugby family, and there's still the values that are upheld across the board, all right, in rugby. But now the game has gone so professional, right? You only have to have a look at the months gone by, the stuff that we've seen around the salary cap, we've seen around the sevens, like all these different things. Rugby is now at the stage where it's about money, right? I mean, you can't get away from that. And coming to the point where you speak about autobiographies, I've been approached to, you know, write an autobiography, and so has Goodey. I don't feel as I'm at the stage yet where I want to open people up, because that's effectively what you have to do. If you're going to be completely honest, and we do a little bit of it on here, but I've got my own story. Goodey's got his own story about different coaches and how you're dealt with. Ultimately, it's a professional game, right? And you can look at it, and I remember being with a player, and I won't mention the club, or maybe mention it in the autobiography, that played at a club for many, many years and was coming towards the end of his career, and turned to the club and said, right, what are you going to do for me now? I'm retiring. And the club said, well, what do you mean, what we're going to do for you now? And they're like, well, I've been a loyal servant here for many, many years. And they were like, yeah, we've paid you probably over £1 million. Like, what do you mean, what we're going to do for you? And that's what it is. You get paid to play, right? I got paid to play in the back end of my career. Was player welfare fair in terms of the way that I was managed, the way that Dylan was kind of managed? Was that at the forefront? No. You effectively become cannon fodder, right? Because the way that sport works, the way that rugby works, is the next generation is coming through. There's an evolution, the one that can train throughout the week, the one that will say yes, the player that won't be divisive. So you're Danny Kerr, arguably, off the back of that. So I think it's great that Dylan's flagged that up, because, again, I'm just seeing positive stuff about Eddie, but there's two ways you can look at it. There's one way you go down it like an honest line, or you can hide away and say, oh, you know, this and this is why we've not picked him. But I actually think Eddie, with the older players, after the World Cup and stuff, dealt with them quite well. You know, he could have come in, and a lot of people didn't want Dylan to play. A lot of people were saying, like, Jamie George is a better player, and, well, not arguably, he was. So from Dylan's point of view, and you write a book, you know, a year after you retire, or how many months it's been, there's still a part of you. And that's why, again, I never wrote a book, and why sometimes you're quite careful, because reflection's a good thing, right? You need to look back on, actually, you get a better perspective of things, you get a better view when you completely take the emotion out. I imagine if you're Dylan, there's still a lot of emotion in there, right? Did he retire at the right time? He'll be thinking about the different relationships that he had. He didn't make 100 caps. I'm sure that was a goal for him. Everything that he had to deal with, but that's sport. Unfortunately, that's rugby. There isn't the loyalty that people think. There just isn't. I don't care what anyone says. Show me where it really is. It's a business at the end of the day, and we've seen that if the last year doesn't show you that, with everything that's happened at Saracens, with everything that's happened around the salary cap, with everything that's happened now in terms of the amount of games that are having to be condensed, with the Lions tour that's coming up with it, which is going to make a significant amount of money. Is player welfare? Are these things at the front of the mind? No. Eddie Jones is going to get judged on winning games, winning World Cups. If that means that a player's fucked, and ultimately it's harsh, and I hate it, and I kind of battle myself all the time in terms of my kids playing rugby, and do I want them to make a living off it? How would have I done things differently? Why wasn't I treated the same way Marrow was treated, or George was treated at Saracens? I battle these things in my mind, but ultimately it doesn't matter. Dylan's had an amazing career. He's a great ambassador, regardless of the past kind of history, discrepancies around discipline that he has. He's been a great ambassador, and he had a great innings. So, but I love it. I love the fact that he's come out and he's saying these things, and I'm sure with Haskell's as well, he's going to come out and say a load of things as well.
I think the thing with it as well, when you're talking about it, Jim, is, and everything you're saying is right, but the other way of looking at it is these players who are in that environment, and Dylan was one of them, Dylan was the leader, was he, or did he have the ability at the time to say the things he's saying now? Probably not, because he's thinking to himself, if I air these grievances now, I'm going to get dropped. So there's 25 grand a week gone from each England game. So you make these decisions along your career. You fight the battles that you think you've got the ability to have a decent positive impact on. And other times you put up and shut up. And that's life, isn't it, really? In every job that we do, you have to fight your battles that you think you're going to win when you're trying to create what you feel is the destiny of a team or whatever. And when you've got a head coach who is someone as mentally strong and as sort of authoritarian as Eddie Jones is, there's little wins you can get, I'm sure, but the big wins, like in every player, you get to the end of a career, some players will look at, and some people will look at Dylan's book now and they'll say, he's saying these things now, it's easy to say it now because he's retired, but it's the right thing for him to do. It's the truth. He's out of that environment. It's not going to affect his selection. It's not going to affect his bank balance on the top of it. And it is brutal saying that. I was in an England camp where I didn't agree. Dave Allred was the kicking coach, who was Johnny Wilkinson's kicking coach, made Johnny what he was, but that worked really well for Johnny Wilkinson. Didn't work for Charlie Hodgson, who's a good mate of mine, and Jim's, and didn't necessarily work for me. But we played the game in camp, and we were sort of sat there, and we'd have conversations about it, going, I don't know what the fuck he's trying to teach us here. Like, he's saying buzzwords to us, and I'm like, I don't know what it means. But in my own mind, I sat there and just thought, I'm just going to nod, because if I question him, does he think I'm not as good as Johnny Wilkinson? Well, of course, we all know I wasn't. But if you question the coach because you don't get it, and you don't want to question him too much because that might impact on selection, you just put up and shut up, don't you? And that's the world we live in. Whatever job you do, certain things you can try and change slowly. There's certain things you can change straight away by saying stuff. And there's certain things that with a head coach like Eddie Jones, you ain't ever going to win. And if he believes the intensity of training and the way they need to do things is right to win games at the weekend, he's had a pretty decent record, hasn't he? So that players are treated like pieces of meat, and unfortunately, that's the world we live in.